Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is a difficult bill. There is a genuinely good purpose to it, that is to prevent fraudulent activity, that is claiming someone else's identity for a fraudulent purpose. However, there is also a big downside. It is, in effect, a significant move in the direction of an electronic ID card, with all the civil liberties difficulties that this entails. The government databases for births, deaths and marriages, civil unions, passport and citizenship will be put at the service not only of public agencies but also private agencies like banks, insurance companies and credit agencies. These private agencies will be able to get the identity of a person confirmed by the state and use that information for their own advantage. It could also enable discrimination against people applying for jobs. For example, one of the pieces of information that employers and others will be provided with instantaneously by email is the place of birth of a person. This can open the way for discrimination on the basis of national origin, as it has overseas in similar circumstances. Take, for example, a South African-born job applicant faced with an employer who is biased against people who, in Paul Henry's terms, is not a real New Zealander. The state will now be providing any such discriminatory employer an immediate check on the applicant's place of birth, and this employer will be able to exclude that person from the job even before they've got to the interview. The potential employee is supposed to give such approval, for the employer to check with the state database, but if he or she really wants the job, they would be unlikely to block it. One thing that particularly concerns the Greens is that the system does provide for what is in effect an electronic ID card via a provision in Clause 5 of the bill whereby identity information includes, quote, the photograph in the passport, end quote. The electronic photograph provides what you could call a biometric identifier of the person. There is already a photographic identification system operating at the smart gates at New Zealand's airports, which compares the features in photographs taken of us as we pass through immigration and customs through the smart gates with a simplified version of our photograph contained in the Immigration and Customs database and in the chip on our passport. According to the Customs website, this, quote, facial recognition technology works by mapping the underlying bone structure of the face, for example, the distance between the eyes, nose, mouth and ears. The measurements are then digitally coded to be used for comparison and verification purposes. With SmartGate, a mathematical formula is used to determine whether the photo of the traveller's face matches their e-passport photo, end quote. So what is likely to happen under this bill, and happen fairly soon, I would imagine, is that when you stand at the counter of your bank, there is likely to be a camera taking a photograph of you as you fill in, say, a form to start up an account. This form will contain a box asking if you agree to the bank checking your identity, which, if you want a bank account, you will be likely to tick. The photograph the bank takes of you will then be emailed to the Department of Internal Affairs, who will then respond in seconds as to whether it matches the digitally coded version of your photograph in their passports database. You might say that that is the same as the existing SmartGate procedure, but firstly you have a choice now of whether or not to use SmartGates to go through customs in a less biometrically intrusive way, and secondly, do we really want all kinds of private agencies such as banks, shops, insurance companies and credit agencies checking us in this way? It is true that under Clause 13 of the bill, government officials must consult the Privacy Commissioner if they are, quote, proposing to enter into a confirmation agreement that will allow a comparison of an individual's photographic image against any photographic images of that individual, end quote. Such a consultation with the Privacy Commissioner is good, but in reality it would only slow down, not stop, the creep towards a universal ID card and all the ethical problems associated with it. If this bill is passed, facial recognition systems may become commonplace in banks and the largest shops. There is already a debate about privacy problems associated with facial recognition systems, particularly around their use on the internet. Google already has a facial recognition system in Picasa to allow people to tag a particular individual in their own photos on the Picasa photo storage site. It can scan thousands of such photographs in an individual set and tag individuals in this manner. Google was also going to introduce a more general facial recognition search function on the web, but pulled back because of a bit of a reaction as to the privacy implications. Another agency, Face.com, already finds photos of people by searching Facebook sites. You can imagine the problem here, not only for people's privacy, but also, for example, a woman trying to stay away from a violent, possessive former spouse. The woman happens to be snapped in a group picture at some event, perhaps without her knowledge, and the picture is then put on the net and discovered by the former spouse who is chasing her by using this facial recognition technology. The debate over privacy issues around facial recognition systems and ID cards is growing around the world. In Britain, the Liberal Democrats made privacy issues a major issue in their election campaign, and the very first bill introduced by the new Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition was the Identity Documents Bill, which cancels the Labor government's program for a universal ID card, a program that was already underway. The bill cancels all those ID cards that have already been handed out and abolishes the National Identity Register. The British Home Secretary, Theresa May, explained to Parliament on 9th of June that the, quote, photographs and fingerprint biometrics on the National Identity Register will be securely destroyed. This will not be a literal bonfire of the last government's vanities, but it will nonetheless be deeply satisfying. The National Identity Register will cease to exist, end quote. The Home Secretary said such moves were not, quote, just about saving money, which was estimated to be about $6 billion US. It is also about principle. We did believe there was a liberties argument for not enforcing ID cards on the British people, end quote. Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said that, quote, cancelling the scheme and abolishing the National Identity Register is a major step in dismantling the surveillance state. But ID cards are just the tip of the iceberg. Today marks the start of a series of radical reforms to restore hard-won British freedoms, end quote. There is also an intention to abolish biometric fingerprint passports, another British Labour Party measure. In New Zealand, we are not, quote, dismantling the surveillance state, end quote, and to use Nick Clegg's words, but extending it, not only through this bill, but also through continually expanding the number of linkages between the database of one government department with the database of another. This is called data matching, and there are now around 50 bilateral operating programs linking the databases of departments covering customs, IRD, ACC, justice, immigration, social development, education and internal affairs. This bill before us allows this data matching in terms of confirmation of identity to extend well beyond existing state agencies to a whole range of private agencies in New Zealand. This bill will also, by its example, encourage more private agencies to keep their own identifying databases of people, including digital photos or digitally coded representations of photos, matching those in the Passports Office database. This identity confirmation bill is not part of what Nick Clegg calls the dismantling of the surveillance state. Rather, it is a step towards such a state. For that reason, the Green Party will be voting against this bill.
I call John